Karl Marx. That name, wow. It's a political buzzword, an entire field of study, a revolutionary slogan, and for a lot of people, it's a serious warning. But behind all that noise is a 19th century philosopher whose ideas didn't just influence the world, they completely fractured it. And let's be real, we're all still living in the aftershocks.
You hear this kind of thing all the time, right? That Marxist influence is going to threaten our very survival. The word gets thrown around, usually as an insult, to describe pretty much anything and everything. It's not a new tactic, but it really does make you wonder.
To get to the bottom of that, we've got to go back, way back. We need to understand the man, the crazy world he lived in, and the powerful, world-changing ideas he unleashed. So, in this explainer, we're going to try to strip away all the rhetoric and get right to the heart of what Karl Marx actually said.
See, Marx's ideas didn't just pop up out of thin air. They were forged in the fire of one of the most chaotic, disruptive periods in all of human history, the Industrial Revolution. This was a moment that didn't just change the world, it completely shattered the old way of life for millions of people.
Just listen to this quote from the philosopher John Stuart Mill. You'd think that all these incredible new inventions, steam engines, power looms, you name it, would make life easier for everybody. But Mill points out that, nope, for most people, they didn't. Instead, these amazing machines just allowed, as he put it, a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment.
And, I mean, this slide really paints a grim picture of that drudgery. You had people flooding into cities only to find themselves crammed into these filthy slums. The factories themselves were basically death traps. Unions were totally illegal, and all the while, a brand new class of factory owners was making money on a scale that nobody had ever seen before. It was this shocking, in-your-face inequality that created the perfect breeding ground for new, radical ideas.
And the big idea that bubbled up out of all this was socialism. Now, that's a huge umbrella term, I know, but the core concept is actually pretty straightforward. Think about a factory. Instead of one person owning it and pocketing all the profits, socialists asked, what if the people who actually work there owned it together? It's all about shifting ownership of the means of production, so the factories, the land, the tools, from private hands to the community, to be run for the good of everyone, not just for profit.
And it wasn't just one single idea. There was this whole spectrum of socialist thought. You had utopian socialists trying to build these perfect little cooperative communities. You had state socialists who thought the government should run everything. Christian socialists saw it as a moral duty. And then you had the anarchists, who just wanted to tear down the whole system. And somewhere in that mix was Marx, and his version of socialism, well, it would become the most influential of them all.
So let's zoom in on the man himself. What made Karl Marx so different was that he didn't just see himself as another guy complaining about capitalism. Oh no, he saw himself as a scientist. He truly believed he had discovered the unchangeable scientific laws that governed all of human history. Laws that pointed not just to a possible future, but an inevitable one.
Marx's life was a wild ride of intellectual passion and constant hardship. He was a radical journalist, got kicked out of countries all across Europe, and eventually had to settle in London. It was there, often living in serious poverty and supported by his good friend Friedrich Engels, that he spent decades hunched over books in the British Museum, poring over economic data to build his massive critique of capitalism, the book that would define his legacy, Das Kapital.
This brings us to his absolute core idea, historical materialism. Okay, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the concept itself is a game changer. Think of society like a building. Marx argued that the foundation, what he called the base, is the economy. You know, who owns what, how stuff gets made. Everything else, our laws, our politics, our culture, even our ideas and beliefs, that's all the superstructure that gets built on top of that economic foundation. So if you want to change the building, Marx said, you have to start by changing the foundation.
And in the capitalist foundation of his time, Marx saw two great opposing forces, two teams in a constant tug-of-war. On one side, you have the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, the owners. On the other, the proletariat, the working class, the ones who own nothing but their ability to work. He argued their goals weren't just different, they were locked in a zero-sum game. The owners need to maximize profit, which means keeping wages low. The workers need to survive, which means pushing wages up. This constant, simmering conflict, he believed, was the real engine driving history forward.
So this brings us to what Marx called capitalism's law of motion.
He wasn't just describing the system as it was, he was basically writing its obituary. He believed that the internal logic of capitalism actually contained the seeds of its own destruction.
At the very heart of this is his theory of exploitation. Let's break it down with a simple example. Imagine a worker in a chair factory. In the first 4 hours of his day, let's say he makes enough chairs to cover the cost of his daily wage. But he doesn't go home then. He has to work another 6 hours. Well, according to Marx, all the value he creates in those extra 6 hours is surplus value. It's essentially unpaid labor, and it all goes directly into the factory owner's pocket as profit. For Marx, this wasn't just some flaw in the system, it was the system.
And for Marx, any system built on this kind of exploitation just couldn't last forever. He believed the internal pressure would just keep building and building until the entire machine reached its breaking point, and the inevitable results he predicted would be a revolution, led by the very people the system was exploiting.
And he even laid out the sequence of events that he saw as absolutely unavoidable. First, competition would get more and more fierce, consolidating wealth and pushing smaller businesses out, making the rich richer. At the same time, the working class would get bigger and more desperate. Forced together in factories and cities, they'd eventually start talking, organizing, and realize their shared struggle, developing what he called class consciousness. And finally, this newly awakened and united class would rise up and seize the means of production for themselves.
So that's the theory. But what happened in reality? Marx's legacy is, to put it mildly, complicated and fiercely debated. So let's take a look at how his big predictions have actually held up over the past 150 years. First things first, you gotta give him credit where it's due. Marx was remarkably spot on about some things. He was one of the first thinkers to see that economic booms and busts weren't just weird accidents, but a built-in feature of capitalism. He absolutely predicted the rise of giant, globe-spanning corporations, and he totally saw how technology would constantly be used to automate jobs and kick humans out of the process. He understood capitalism not as some static thing, but as this relentless, shape-shifting force, an insight that's more relevant today than ever.
But, and this is a huge but, his crystal ball is also deeply flawed. That core theory of his about how value is created, it's been pretty much abandoned by modern economists, and his central prediction that workers would get poorer and poorer, that turned out to be spectacularly wrong. In advanced capitalist countries, a huge middle class emerged, which completely blew up his whole vision of two warring classes. And when communist revolutions did happen, they weren't in industrial powerhouses like Germany or Britain like he predicted, but in largely agrarian societies like Russia and China.
And yet, despite these massive analytical failures, this final line from the Communist Manifesto, the one etched on his gravestone, it just captures the raw power of his message. It was a call to action that ignored borders and resonated with millions, inspiring movements and revolutions that would go on to define the entire 20th century.
So why are we still talking about him? Well, just look at this number. In 2023, the top 10% of earners in the US held over 60% of the entire nation's wealth. So, Marx's predictions about an inevitable revolution may have failed, but his fundamental questions, about where wealth comes from, who really benefits from it, and whether that kind of concentration of power is sustainable, well, those questions have never gone away.
So we're left with this question. In a world of gig economies, artificial intelligence, and globalization, forces Marx could have never even imagined, do his critiques of capitalism still matter? The answer seems to be that while Marx's solutions may have been wrong, even dangerously so in some cases, his diagnosis of the system's inherent tensions and inequalities, that continues to be almost impossible to ignore. And that's why, for better or for worse, we are all still living in the world that he helped to define.